Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a dear friend of ours, Justin Caffrey. We've wanted Justin as a guest on our show. It is a show, isn't it? On our show.
Definitely a show.
Okay, it's most definitely a show.
It's a show!
Yes! Well,
Sorry,
where
if
are
I
the
heard your ears.
dancers?
You don't need
Okay,
dancers.
sorry,
We
okay.
are the dancers.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, we've wanted Justin as a guest on the podcast for ages. He's brilliant. He's wonderful. He's been a dear friend for years and someone who we admire dearly. And welcome, JC. We call him JC not because he's Jesus Christ, but Justin Caffrey.
Thanks.
Just
Thanks,
to clarify.
lads. I'm only staying here if it's definitely a show.
Okay, it is a show.
All
It's
right.
going to be a show. We're going to
Okay.
put on a show,
We're
JC.
going to put on a show today. All right.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, so maybe let's start back with give a context of the Justin Caffrey because Steve.
I go?
Yeah, you can go. Yeah.
JC, I think a really important topic and something that's super undervalued in most relationships, in most organizations and most human interactions is the concept of safety and psychological safety. I wonder if we could kick it off with that.
Can I give a story to that now?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I never realized safety was so important in terms of relationship. And I'm talking about intimate relationships where you're, with a partner or whatnot. And I never realized that it was super important until I met my wife. She obviously wasn't my wife when I met her. But I realized that she really made me feel safe, And that's enabled me to explore my curiosities and also come home and feel like, oh, wow, I've got safety at home, which has been a beautiful lesson for me. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it because I know you explore this loads.
Nice. Yeah. I think it's, I think the whole idea of psychological safety, it kind of gets lost. When I deliver this to executive teams first, that the idea of possibly bringing it into the workplace, a lot of executives are petrified at the idea because the psychological safety mean that everybody's going to get a bit soft and we're not going to get anywhere, and before I know where I'm going, nobody's doing what's needed in terms of the workplace. And it is that idea of vulnerability. So like you say, David, like the whole idea of being in the relationship and finding that with Sab and I found that myself with my own wife. If you can find that space where it's okay to be authentically you and to speak from a place of vulnerability, the impact and how you feel in that relationship is quite profound and longer lasting. And I'd say, like, in terms of my relationship, it probably took me 5 years of my marriage to really find that gear. But in a corporate setting, the criticism a lot nowadays is, Generation Z and millennials, snowflakes, too soft, expect too much, etc. And I see it completely differently. I see it as a capacity to be able to say what's needed in order for me to want to stay in this environment, whether it's the relationship or whether it's work. And in contrast to that, my generation, I started working in London in 1995. It was anything but safe. To speak up about how you felt was just not acceptable, and it was kill or be killed in terms of how you work. So there was no alternative other than to kowtow down to authority and deliver. And I remember my first experience of thinking there's something not right. I was quite young. I was about 23. We had a tragedy in the family where my nephew died. He was 18 months old. I happened to fly back to Dublin for that. I flew back. I was here when he died, and then I stayed for a couple of weeks to deal with his funeral and the impact on my family. And then I flew back to the UK, and I was back maybe 6 or 7 days. I wasn't particularly feeling great, as you can imagine. And I got a phone call from my boss who said to me, okay, it's time to come back to work now. You need to get on with it. And it wasn't like, hi, how are you? Are you okay? It was, it's time to get back to work. And I knew that there was no alternative at that moment, that I had to be back in work. And if I didn't, I was just going to get fired. And the shift now is, thankfully, younger people are willing to say, I need more time, or I need more space, or I need to speak about how somebody's talking to me in the office. And it's also about their capacity to speak truth to power. So in that scenario, the last thing I could do was speak truth to power. When you suppress not speaking truth to power, then something else happens. And, roll on 18 months and I gave that person two fingers and walked out, because what was suppressed inside me was anger, and anger then eventually explodes, and we don't necessarily do the best things. So what we're trying to do with psychological safety is to encourage it as a means of communication. And in high performance teams, it's top of the list in terms of how do we achieve our goals. Because if we have open and honest conversations, it means that those who are below the power can speak truth to power. But in order to open that highway, it must work both ways. So it also means that in organizations, you will have a forum where you allow people to speak, but equally, you have a level of communication back to those people who are working within your team. So it's okay to walk up to somebody rather than it being an annual review and say, hey, can we sit down and talk about your performance? I think there's some things you need to work on. And that way, there's no surprises and everybody's communicating.
What did Ray Dalio, the Bridgewater guy, he calls it candid honesty or
feedback? It's not ruthless,
candid
it's
something.
like something
Candour.
Candour.
I mean, Candour is like so American, right? And
Yeah, I don't really know what that means. Sounds like candy.
It's like honesty, isn't it? It's to be honest.
It's absolute honesty, right? It's absolute honesty. And I was teaching it in a workshop yesterday. Like the Harvard Business School talk about some of the key tests of psychological safety for leadership, right? So one of them is that leaders are willing to be open and vulnerable. So when you make a mistake, put your hand up and say, sorry about that, I ballsed up. I'm going to work better. I'm going to work harder. So what that means that people see you as a relatable party. So the relationship between employees and employer, and
Human rather than robotic.
Exactly, human rather than robotic. So that's one part of it. But some of the tests are being able to speak to people in your office. So, one of the things that I talk about is if you're in a meeting and, there's 6 or 7 people in a meeting and the person sitting beside you has a bogey hanging out of their nose. Everybody in the room knows that there's a bogey hanging out of their nose, and pointing it out in the room is not really very nice. But a leader who's respectful of how this room needs to feel and be might just say quietly in the person's ear, you might want to just wipe your nose, because they are in a position where other people are looking at them in a very different light in that room. The attention is on them. They don't even know it's on them.
It's a nice example.
And it just allows you to show, hey, you might do this. You do it quietly. There's no judgment. And it just helps them
And
out.
there's no shame by doing it publicly, by going, hey, look, that type of
Absolutely.
thing, which can often be the case.
But also it seems like when you're talking about their psychological safety, like particularly in a workplace where there's a manager or a boss and there's an employee and whatever, it's almost like taking away the hierarchy and being two flawed, vulnerable humans, being open and honest and communicating. Like, and whether it's in the workplace or in a relationship, ultimately safety, psychological safety is feeling vulnerable enough to be, or feeling safe enough to be open and be your full self, warts and all, because I think we connect as individuals more via our warts, or as in our insecurities, our flaws. These things are much more related than you've got a fancy car and you are super confident, and those are typically not that relatable. Like sometimes people will say me and Steve are unrelatable because we're like, we're so high energy or whatever. But then when we're actually when we're insecure and feeling tired and whatever, maybe we're more relatable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, in terms of that as a really good example of perception, like the three of us have got to know each other really well over the years, and we've spoken really vulnerably to each other at times. Okay, so we kind of know what's beneath the surface. And equally, when you're a leader inside an organization or a sports environment, being able to have that, self-awareness and to be humble, humility as a superpower in leadership is absolutely massive, because it makes you relatable. It makes people feel safer around you. And it's also helpful because when your team know that you make mistakes and that you struggle too, and you might talk about, I have anxiety, or I sometimes feel challenged, or I feel maybe I'm not good enough, or I need to work harder. Then they start to think, oh, it's not just me. Because most people who have the internal dialogue in their heads can often feel like I'm on my own. And then we look around and we see everybody else who seems to be doing super well. But often most people are just like, the proverbial duck. It looks great as it's moving along the top of the water, but there's an awful lot of movement going on underneath. So that relatability, I think, is super important. And there's a funny example of how young people are changing the workforce. So it was last summer, there's a senior partner of one of the top accountancy firms in the world in London decides that, okay, it's time for everybody to come back to work again now, back into the office. I've had enough of, COVID and all that kind of stuff that's going on. So he does a Zoom call with the whole organization. And his positioning of the camera and everything else is kind of lower down, and he's really on top of the camera, and he's like really crowding the whole space, and he's David.
Sorry.
And
I was expecting a call earlier, and I turned it on.
And he's expecting everybody to come on, listen to this great sermon from the Mount, right, about how we're going to change back to the way we were in 5 days a week in the office. So he starts this whole pitch off by dismissing, COVID and that, really it's not that bad, and people need to kind of, pull up their socks now and get back to work, etc., etc. Not really reading the room, because of course in a large organization, many people may have had relatives who had COVID and died, parents, grandparents. The impact in terms of people's psychological welfare, a lot of people suddenly were cut off from the outside world, especially young people, where they should be having a more social scene, and all of a sudden that's ended. So he doesn't read the room. He's kind of dismissing the whole idea of it. And as he's giving this sermon, well, Generation Z and millennials are recording it and they're posting it. So he starts trending whilst he's delivering this talk. And trending not in a very good way. And one of the things he said on that call was like, and this is important in terms of our clients. Our clients want to see people back in work again. Our clients want this, our clients want that. Well, post the call, it was the clients who called the shots, because they basically said, unless this guy is gotten rid of, we're pulling our work. And these were like multi-million dollar contracts. So that's the impact when you misread the room. Leaders in this world now either evolve or die. And he was the dinosaur. He was taken
like the
out.
balancing between the masculine and the feminine, not male and female. But it's like, traditionally, like the workplace has been very, macho and very like coming from the Industrial Revolution and very hierarchical and very kind of power and authoritarian. And then it's kind of in recent, there seems to be more, which thankfully there's more bringing in of the feminine energy, the more showing of vulnerability, the showing of emotion, the showing of that we're all floored, and more democracy, and more like, if we want a more engaged workplace or team or anything, it's to try to bring the whole of the person, and the whole of the person is the flawed bits as well as the pretense, like the bits where they're putting on a good show. Show must go on, and I think the more of that, the more.
Well, it's the classical, all those Walt Disney movies that we would have grown up watching, Mighty Ducks, or those kind of.
Oh, I love those.
Those typical team ones where it's a bunch of kind of misfits. They come together and they're playing against the elite athletes and the
Swedish, whatever. It's normally
the bunch of misfits kind of come together, and then they're fighting, and there's so much, and then suddenly they gel and they overcome the bunch of individuals. And I think it's just that quintessential metaphor of that. A team, as some of the parts, can be better than a bunch of individuals. And I think ultimately any team, whether it's a relationship, whether it's an intimate relationship, whether it's a family, whether it's a business relationship, whether it is actually a sporting team, I think ultimately the more people feel safe, exactly what you're saying, the more likely they are to bring all of themselves, and not just bring part of themselves, particularly in work. Like, there's a lot of people will just bring, it's just work. Like, I only bring a side of myself. I don't bring the fact that I'm into music, or I'm a comedian, or I love dogs, or I love getting dressed up in fancy dress the weekend, whatever it might be,
Or you remember you'd ask a friend how was work, he said, yeah, I put in a good 5 out of 10.
Yeah,
and I think that's kind of often very epitomizes much of the modern day. Some of, but it's like, I guess the goal is with engagement is how to bring more of ourselves to all our relationships and all our high performance teams.
Yeah, it is. And I think that more of ourselves as well is just like authentic self, like as a coach, and people come work with me and they say, I want to be better. And I'm like, well, I'm not really interested in that. I'm really interested in what's it like to be you. Like, what's it like to really be you, to be super comfortable around the idea of being you, to be okay with making tough calls, with making decisions that are not there to please everybody else. Like that's the real essence of authenticity. And in psychologically safe teams, you want to have an environment where everybody feels okay to speak up, because sometimes the greatest ideas will come from the quietest voices in an organization. But if you don't create the environment where everybody feels safe to speak, then those people who may have that solution will stay quiet. And what's interesting in terms of how that plays out is that if you have people in an organization who feel safe, they're less likely to leave. And they're less likely to leave even for pay rises. I mean, McKinsey, who are one of the biggest consultancies in the world, carried out an extensive study on this in 2021. And the data is just clear and present that where people feel safe, they feel that this is a tribe. So it goes back to our biological needs. It's Maslow's hierarchy territory, right? Where we feel like we're safe and the people around us have our back, then we're unlikely to feel stressed. So we're not moving into that fight and flight. So when we're in that fight and flight, that's when people change jobs, change relationships. Hopefully over there where the grass is greener, I'll feel better. So for organizations, when they can make the environment safe, people stay. And the good news is that's where you get organizations to agree to invest in psychological safety, because sadly, of course, it still needs to make companies more profitable in order to bring these softer skills in. And if we want to be more altruistic, and if we want to have more vulnerability, and we want to have, a capacity to actively listen within the management structure, they will want to see that it improves the bottom line. And thankfully, Harvard Business School and the biggest study ever carried out on any organizational side through Google, through something called Project Aristotle, has proven that it makes businesses more profitable. So it's something that we finally have happier people and more money. So that
wow.
works.
So like the finding of that was that literally if people feel more safe and more supported to bring more themselves, it results in a more profitable organization.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because not only does it result in a more profitable organization, but it results in more safety in terms of how people are. But culturally, people feel that their input is valuable. So you have people who say, well, I think we should do this a little bit differently, and I've been watching this. And when you talk about how does that work in practice inside of a company, if companies hold, a forum where the CEO or one of the directors is talking to all the staff and they say, we really want innovation and ideas, we want people to put things forward, you have to then create an environment where every idea is heard and listened to. So if somebody says, I think it would be a phenomenally good idea if we had a canteen that was going to bring in whole foods, fruits and vegetables, and there was a nice, water supply and fruit juices every morning, I think that'd be really good. So in terms of the wellness culture of a business, absolutely. So the leader would say, well, thanks for that suggestion. We'll take that on board and we'll come back to you. Then somebody else pipes up and says, I think it'd be fantastic if we had a machine that was dispensing, chips and crisps and sweets and all the bad things. Now, when that person speaks up, some of the room will start to chuckle a bit and they might say, well, that's not really what we want. That's not part of our wellness. And the leader could dismiss them, or they could dismiss the healthy person, depending on who the leader is. But the idea is accept both ideas, thank both people for their contribution, and go away. Because within the psychologically safe environment, we're not saying we'll do everything, but we'll listen to everything with equal intent. And then we'll feed back and say, we've decided that we're going to do this, this, and this. So it's that collegiate, open conversation.
It's kind of redefining leaders, really, in a sense, because like we had a conversation with a lovely lady, Joanne Hessian, and she was all about leadership. And she was talking, like, typically when I thought about that word leadership, I was thinking, oh, it's American, woo, woo, it's that kind of motivation-y kind of stuff. And she was talking about it in the reference to the soft skills, like the soft skills, the EQ skills rather than the IQ skills. Like the being a better listener, being more emotionally intelligent, being more aware of other people's needs. I can't remember the 8 pillars which she had in it, but it was just like, ultimately it's about becoming a more evolved version of yourself, a more empathetic, caring, kind version of yourself. And particularly in the context of teams and relationships, it's about, if we want to go far, we need to go together. Whereas if you want to go quick, go alone, that kind of metaphor. And yeah, I think it's, I don't have any point other than just that waffle.
It's nice. It's good though.
And there was one more thing in the psychological safety I was thinking there is like, people will often go to me and Steve like, geez, you're fucking mad. Like, how did you do this, that, or whatever? Like, you know, they might say, I don't know what they'd be talking about. And we'd often kind of be chatting about it. And then we might get to the place where, well, I guess because there's two of us, and I know no matter what, like no matter how stupid I am or what I do, I know Steve will probably be standing there by my shoulder go, it's all right, Dave, get up there. Come on, we're grand. We get on with this. And I guess it's ultimately we've both being the product of serious psychological safety, because every day of our life we've had someone standing beside us or someone at our back.
Your
Like
biggest cheerleader going, go Dave, go Dave.
Yeah. Which is like, because I remember in school, if one of us got a dig, like, you know, the other one of us would be two fists come and hit the other person. And then I remember it kind of like that works wonderfully in psychological safety, but then in the other extreme, it's kind of like we're our own echo chamber, because I'd be saying, oh geez, Steve, you're brilliant, you're so good at that, and then you think you're brilliant at something, and I'm so biased that we'd end up way off course than where we, you know. So I guess there's
pros and cons of everything.
Yeah, I think it is. I think, look, it's great to have that sense of having your back. And a lot of the times, you know, a lot of leaders in their like 40s and 50s now in this world have come from a very different culture. You know, so the people that I work with are so far away from this concept, and it feels almost unattainable at times. But it's that idea of trying to do less to accomplish more, you know, kind of slowing down to go and better understand yourself and to become an active listener. So one of the biggest skills is just actively listening, and don't speak and then come back later on with some ideas. And that capacity is a skill that most people can eventually learn, but it's important to keep it simple. So we don't want to try and roll out, here are the 8 key things that you need to change in your life to be a more psychologically safe leader, because that's too complicated. But from where I've come from, you know, I was very much a myopic, you know, so driven, focused, determined individual, and I would do whatever I needed in the most ruthless sense at all costs.
The macho in the jungle, you know, literally, because it was a very macho, like, you know, finance and.
But before we get into this, can I just ask one question before we go into that? I was just going to say, is there any correlation between, like, because almost what we're talking about is like, particularly in the context of an organization or a team or a group of people wanting to achieve some kind of output, like what we're talking about here is someone that's got very high EQ, and they're less ego driven, and the stereotypical that certainly we've grown up, we're in our 40s, all of us, and that idea was the kind of alpha male that was the biggest in the room, the most dramatic, and that was the leader. Whereas what we're kind of talking about more is someone who's very emotionally aware and more has those softer traits. And I'm wondering, is there more of a link between female leaders versus male leaders? Because I think certainly for our era, it's your counterculture if you're a very high EQ male leader, whereas it probably comes more naturally to women to be better listeners and to be more empathetic and whatnot. And I wonder, is there any data on that? Or
yeah, so yes and no, because so one of the really interesting things from the pandemic was that we had people working from home, right? So we had a huge swathe of people all over the world who'd go and work from home. On the return to work data, where people are coming back to the office, what was interesting is 2 different studies. One looking at ethnic minorities coming back to work, right? And the really stark data was that ethnic minorities, I think it's 3% in the study, wanted to come back to the workplace. And the biggest reason why 97% didn't want to come back was the fact that they had to go through this kind of code adaptation in order to be in work. So they had to assimilate their white colleagues to be okay in work. And there's a really phenomenal lady who dug into this, Abby Edmondson in the US. And what they found was that for ethnic minorities to come into the workplace, they really felt that they had to dress differently at times. They had to speak differently at times. And they, a lot of the Black African American community were talking about the fact that their white colleagues started to feel like it was okay to talk about their hair or touch their hair. So this study started to show how unpsychologically safe the workplace can be for ethnic minorities, because when they worked at home, they were able to be authentically themselves. And the results of being authentic themselves made them feel more comfortable, which meant they brought more of themselves to the workplace. And a similar study was looking at the difference between male and females returning back to the workplace. And again, in leadership teams, and I find this a lot. I work with quite a few leadership teams in London, and a lot of very senior executives now are women. And often the challenge can be that they almost need to sometimes lean into higher levels of masculinity to compete in that environment. And that can be challenging too. So I don't think it's as simple as saying male, female. I definitely think it's
masculine and feminine.
Masculine and feminine.
It's much more about like traditionally it was more the masculine energy or the masculine archetype, and I think it's more about getting into that feminine, that soft, that more better listener, that better.
So not be bound by your genitalia or your
exactly.
gender,
identity, your
much more
identity.
gendered, much more about your expression of energy.
Just try and listen. Like that's the biggest thing. It's to try and compassionately listen as best you can, and I think meeting people wherever they are, that's key. And if you look at, in sport, we see where psychological safety works really well, and Jurgen Klopp, who's the manager of Liverpool, is a really good example of somebody who brings that epitome to high performance sport. He understands how to motivate each player differently. So some people need a bit of a kick, some people need a bit of a hug.
Others need loads of praise.
Some people need loads of praise, right? We know about that.
Oh, yes, Steve.
He does that really well.
I think you're great, Dave.
And he has brought such a high performance element to his group. And I remember hearing him being interviewed about this, and the interviewer, I think it was Gabby Logan, said to him, "What is it that you have that is so different to everybody else in terms of how you manage people?" And he says, "To be honest, I just look at them all and meet them as they are. I think it's common sense." But he said, as we know, that's not very common.
I think
it's that simple sometimes.
Meet people
but
where
it's
they are.
just awareness, self-awareness.
I like that you one thing you said as well, that often when people don't feel psychologically safe in a relationship, in a team sport or in the workplace, they're typically in their fight or flight response, and when they're in fight or flight response, they're caught up and they're only typically using 40 to 50% of their brain capacity because they're in this adrenaline fueled unsafe feeling.
Well, you even think of yourself, like when you're most productive is probably when you're slightly tired. Like I think of myself, and that's why I'm kind of objecting onto you, is that like you're probably
Thanks, Dave.
most creative when you're relaxed, like when you've had a good run and you've got that kind of like that itchy
Wild dog
energy out of you, and then you're like, oh wow, like, and then you can let your creativity go wild. And same way when we travel, like you often say like, geez, I'm like swimming in pure potentiality here, because you're not bound by, you're not stressed.
Paul jokes that it does airport emails. Typically on a plane, I could be writing 25 emails and then land and just
because
oh my god,
because you're not you're not stressed, you're not in the daily kind of doing mode. You've got a little bit of space, so therefore your mind runs wild.
But I was asking Justin about it.
Sorry, I went off and around. I'm not listening more. I'm being crap. Sorry.
That's all right.
Thanks. We
lads. Still appreciate it.
Thanks a million, lads. I love you.
I think, so funny enough, part of what I teach is something called polyvagal theory, which is the
polyamorous theory.
Polyvagal theory.
That's a different podcast. So polyvagal theory is that whole idea of understanding the fight and flight response versus, the rest and recovery, and how do we stay inside homeostasis. So when it comes to high performance, it's critical. It's that when you see the Johnny Sextons of the world move out of, the cut and thrust of a combative game of rugby, and then they have to basically play chess with maths to try and figure out, how do I kick this little ball in the wind, through those goalposts. It's a very much different skill. So when you see the rugby players, moving up and down on their feet and just breathing, it's that idea from a sports psychology perspective. As you reconnect with your nervous system and move it out of that fight-flight response and get it into homeostasis, then you're reconnecting, as you said, Stephen, the lack of cognitive ability. And we know it's a 60% decline in cognitive ability when you're in a stress state. But if you can just spend 60 to 90 seconds breathing, you can reconnect to your full cognitive ability. So you can then read the wind, understand the angles, make the connection, and just be in flow.
And nail that kick.
So down regulate your breath. Like we chatted with Patrick McKeown last week, and he was all about down regulating your breath, a longer out breath, having somewhere between 4.5 and 6 breaths per minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Critical. And this is a thing that I teach leaders and people who were like me at the start, looking at me going, so you're telling me that you're going to teach me how to breathe differently and I'm going to perform differently. I'm like, yeah, just got to wait. It's going to take a bit of time. It's going to take some months.
But to those traditional leaders, they're like, I don't want that. I want a 5-year plan and I want to actually, you know, it's a different energy.
What's the ROI on this?
Like what you're bringing is this, it's like the epitome of anyone who read Stephen Covey's book, the 7 Habits, to sharpen the saw.
Yeah.
You know, it's in essence that. It's how to, these deep fundamental changes that you can do that change everything of your life.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. There's a poem. So Taoism, which predates, you know, Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity. There's a poem. It's 5,000 years old, and it talks about this archer who's going to take a shot, and it talks about the fact that the archer is so proficient, he always hits the target, and he enjoys the challenge. But the minute he moves to hit the brass buckle, all of a sudden, it's a little bit more difficult to hit the target. And then
what do you mean, like as in it's a prize or something?
It's a prize.
Okay.
So exactly. So it moves up. All of a sudden, now have a prize, and then he moves up to a silver prize, and it becomes more difficult. So now the target's nearly doubled, and then it comes up to the gold prize, and he's kind of outside of his body. It's so hard to do it. But if the archer just learns to breathe and remember what it was like to do it for fun, then he can hit the target. And that's the idea of, you know, flow state, wu wei, as the Chinese say, when you have your energy moving in the right direction. So the qi of the energy is in flow, which happens through the breath. So we can make really, really good decisions. I teach teams how to negotiate by using mindfulness and meditation practices, because if 2 people walk into a room to negotiate, one person comes from the last meeting on their phone, stressed, thinking about where they're going next. They come in, they sit down. The other person, who is like the archer, they've learned to remember all the successes, when it was good, when they were happy. They've done some breathing before they walked into the negotiation. They have a practice of breathing and meditation maybe before they go into the session. So then they sit down. And this is where the power of listening becomes the power of profitable listening. Because when people negotiate, somebody wants to win. And everybody struggles when it's quiet. So when there's a void, somebody else will talk. So if you're able to go in calm, conscious of your breath, slowing down, and you create a void, the other person will fill the void. And quite often with information that you need to win the negotiation. So it's slowing down and just, you know, connecting to yourself.
Even in that analogy, it made me think of back when we were like 16, 17, we used to be so into golf. Like we were absolute golf nuts. And I remember playing in the Leinster boys. We were probably 16 or 17.
Wicklow or Leinster?
I think it was the Leinster boys, and we just got in. It was in Greystones, and we had been playing so much, and we're hyper competitive. And I remember, like, we were really good. And I remember going out, and I was playing with 2 lads that had, like, one had won the Irish something or other, and someone else was a big deal. And I was kind of go, oh my god, here we go. And I went out, and I kind of played crap. And then afterwards, we went to the putting and the chipping green, and I hit the flag on every shot. I was hitting everything, like, right beside the pin, and they were going, oh my god, like, you're a totally different player here in the practice ground. And it was very interesting to see with pressure. I was exactly like the archer. And then I remember like a year later playing in the Wicklow boys, and it was the final round. I was going into leading, and I remember there was this old guy walked at me, an old guy from our golf club walked at me.
What was his name?
Brian O'Connor.
Yeah.
Brian O'Connor. He was like a magical angel because he died soon after that. But he walked with me, and I chatted away with him, and I could have been out, and it was like a summer's day. There was no competition going on because I was in my head, because I was just having this lovely chat, and I was laughing away. And I played, like, the golf just was the easiest thing in the world, and I ended up winning the tournament. And it was just literally that, down to exactly what you're saying, the mentality of going, when you're in that fight or flight phase, you're never going to perform as well as when you're relaxed and at ease.
And in flow.
And exactly that. If you remove that kind of judgment from the workplace, so bring this back to the workplace, where it's okay to make a mistake, where we kind of accept that people make mistakes, where leaders speak about, I make mistakes too. We want to actually actively encourage people to feel okay about making mistakes, because when they do, then they feel it's okay to take risks. They feel like it's okay to step up and perform, because if I'm not going to feel like everybody's judging me and laughing at me, and this is an environment where it's okay to take risks, then For some people, that will be really kind of audacious, bold decisions that can change the dynamic of the organization. For other people, that will be just a quiet hand going up in a meeting that makes a suggestion that might save the organization €500,000. So it's create the environment so that the collective of all the personalities feel okay. Because even, we've talked about this before, and we're similar personalities in terms of our competitive nature and stuff, but equally you don't want to look like a fool in front of a bunch of people either. So it's not like we've managed to carve that bit out of us. We still feel hurt when people around us might be dismissing us and ridiculing us, but leaders are able to kind of make it look like it's okay and they don't feel that. But when it's really impactful is to say, well, actually I struggle too. And then people realize, oh, okay, so everybody's struggling. And it's about just try your best every day. And that environment brings excellence in terms of performance in teams.
Brilliant. The irony that excellence, you don't think of excellence as, something that encourages failure, and not encourages, but allows failure and kind of helps people learn from failure. And
well, it's the kind of diluting of ego and the more, together. I think that's the one. Can we get into... Like you're like the JC that we know today wasn't the JC of 20 years ago. And I think your story of transformation is great and really fun. And, it's very interesting and relatable. So I'd love if you could talk about, the capitalist financial Justin versus the Justin of today and some of the journey along there. Now, that's a very big question, but...
Yeah, but it's a really fun one. Entertain us, Justin.
We'd love to. It's like we're ready for a story.
Okay. Do you want me to get your blankets?
You took us in.
Great. Yeah.
Can we get some warm cocoa as well? Some hot cocoa?
No problem. Cocoa on the way. I think, I went to London when I was 19. I came from Dublin. At that stage, Ireland was a very...
And you grew up in
place.
Ballymun, which is a place that typically doesn't... doesn't breed that many high financial, people that go to London.
I think you went to school in Ballymun or near Ballymun.
I was going to say, I grew up in Santry, right? My mother would not be happy if she said I grew up in Ballymun, right? Because my mother is very posh about where she lives.
And rightly so.
And rightly so. But unquestionably, we were working class. Sorry, mammy. But, that was the environment we grew up in. And I went to school in Ballymun, very, very rough, tough primary school. I went to secondary school in Whitehall, St. Aidan's, and funny enough, I heard a radio interview recently with somebody who'd been to that school, who's the head of the RTE Philharmonic Orchestra, talking about how horrendous it was to go to that school because you went in every day, keeping your wits about you, knowing that one wrong move and it was all going to end up in a big scrap. So it was a very rough and tough environment in primary school.
Not psychologically safe.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I mean, not psychologically safe in terms of quite often the pupils and then some of the teachers and dare I say it, the Christian brothers as well. So you were navigating a lot in terms of getting through it. And don't get me wrong, I actually had a great time, right? I loved school. I had really good time there. But it also was a good kind of breeding ground to that kill or be killed mentality and that understanding that as we all learn at some point in our lives, nobody's coming to save you, unless you're able to manage your own issues in school or life. And at some point we all find that out. You're on your own. So that was a good breeding ground. I ended up going to London after school. I went to do computer science and dropped out of college after about 4 months and went to work in banking in London. Had a very successful career. By the time I was 21, 22, I was managing a team of 10 or 12 people. I was making, back then, probably 120, 130,000 pounds.
As a 21-year-old?
Yeah. Yeah. It was kind of obnoxious.
And this is about 1950 or something, isn't it?
1962. Sorry. Hey, don't let the grey hair fool you.
Sorry, I couldn't help it. You left the door open there.
Yeah, I know I did. I lined it
so
up.
2000 or something like that.
This would have been 1997.
Wow, it's a lot of money for that time.
That was a lot of money, and for every extra pound, I grew an extra bit of ego. So it definitely fed into that egotistical view of yourself, and you start to feel like, you know, you're invincible. And I was probably, I would say, a difficult person to be around, because all I wanted to do was work. So in hindsight, when I look back, I can see I developed a workaholic approach to life, and I didn't really socialize or do anything else, and work was my focus. And after a few years in banking, I left and set up a business with a partner of mine, two guys, and we built an organization over the next few years that became one of the biggest independent financial services companies in the UK. We had a couple of hundred staff and offices in different places, and it was all very exciting, but it was purely focused on, you know, the next deal, the next bit of success, push harder, keep going, and not having a personal life, a social life, not, you know, interacting really. And thankfully then I met my wife when I was 30, and that started to bring the possibility of some change into my life. But I still really hadn't got a sense of what it was like to be a conscious human being. You know, all I knew was...
And what do you mean by conscious? Because that word can mean a lot of things to a lot of people.
Maybe it's like, to go back on the issue of psychological safety, that you were still largely in that fight or flight, like eat or be eaten type mindset, and that you weren't bringing this whole other, like you were caught up in your masculine energy as opposed to the feminine energy. There was very little of this feminine energy in it all. So you was like half of you was being expressed.
Totally. I mean, when I look back retrospectively, if I had some of the skills now back then, the impact would have been far greater. So people often say, well, you're not a bit softer now compared to how you were then. The difference is I'm much more aware now. So I would actually see what's actually really happening in a negotiation. I would be able to listen more impactfully. Back then it was grab, push, grow. I want to win at all costs, right? You know, it was like, everything was just competition and you just wanted to win. So I think...
Therefore, were you quite a stressed kind of character and like blowing up all the like regularly at that stage? Because, you know, you can't always win, you know, that kind of way, and therefore...
I wish I was, right? I internalized everything. So I was more, you know, containing and holding back. And I had this immense capacity to deal with huge levels of stress and turbulence and lots of challenges in growing a very difficult and complex business. But I didn't really have an outlet for it. So that works really well for a while, and then it stops. And I sold a business in 2007, and I had to take some time out after I'd sold it because I couldn't work after I'd exited. I was trying to figure out what I do next and where will I spend my energy. And we were then thinking, well, where will we go and live? What should we do? We just had our first child. And
you're early 30s at this stage.
Yeah, I was like 31, 32. And I couldn't really find anything that I wanted to do. So it was like, I just need to start working again. So financial crisis was kind of kicking off at that stage. And I was doing all kinds of mad stuff. We were raising money for movies. We were raising money for aircrafts because all of the major banks around the world had pulled themselves out of the normal things that they would provide money to. So I was back immersed in all that mayhem. And during that period of time, my wife was pregnant again. So we thought we were having our second child, and then she miscarried, and then she got pregnant again, and then she miscarried, and then she got pregnant again, and then she miscarried. And I was so not present for any of those experiences. Like, she went to the hospital on her own. I was too busy. I was, you know, changing the world. I wasn't able to be there. And I had no concept of what she was going through. So conscious, I mean, just aware of anybody else except what it is that I think is really, really important. And we then decided we're not going to have any more kids after she had the third miscarriage. And as we had that conversation 2 days later, we find out she's pregnant. So 6 months into that pregnancy, we think, well, let's go to Spain. Let's have a last vacation before we have the second child. And we're on vacation. We're a week into our holiday, and she wakes me up at 3:00 in the morning to tell me that her waters are broken. And I'm like, what? I can't get my head around that. And we were in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't like we'd gone to, you know, Marbella or something. We were way out in the middle of nowhere. So what ensued was a life-changing moment, which meant that we were stuck in Spain. So we got her to a hospital. They sustained her, but a week later, they lost the heartbeat. The baby had to be born by emergency cesarean. He had a brain injury due to lack of oxygen, and he was in intensive care, and our life stopped. So we then got stuck in Spain for a year because he was in neonatal intensive care. We couldn't get him out. He wasn't well enough. He had multiple health challenges, but he was alive, and we wanted to keep him alive as best we could. So everything kind of all of a sudden was very different. And what was really noticeable for me was how absolutely present I was to them, because everything else that you think is important all of a sudden is just blown away. And all you're focused on is, how do we keep our other child, who's 3, feeling like he's safe and he's okay, because now we're in a foreign country, we don't speak the language, never any intentions of being here. We have a baby who's in neonatal intensive care, and we're talking to medical teams about neurological injuries, and again, we don't speak the language. So that journey, which lasted nearly a year, was fraught with many ups and downs. But I have incredibly fond memories because I was so present. I was there with Luca, who's now 15, bringing him to school, part of his life, bringing him to the playground. So one of us would be with Joshua, who was our younger son, and one of us would be with Luca. So we were managing our time and kind of ships in the night, and we had family come over every now and then to help us, but predominantly it was us. So that idea of presence was really there, and that idea of slowing down and paying attention to what's really important to you became quite clear. But in the end, Joshua didn't make it. So after 11 months, he was being put back on life support for the 4th time. And our medical team said it was Christmas Day. And they said, look, we know the fight that you guys have put in, and we understand how much you want to keep your son alive. But 4 times, and I've seen it firsthand twice, where they have to intubate a baby, and they're like holding him down by his hands and his feet, and then they have to pump huge amounts of drugs in, and all the rehab that you've done in the lead up to that's reversed. So the physician said, look, we're not going to do it again. He's just not going to make it. And the 5th time is just no place to go. And we were lucky in Spain that they would do that. It's quite likely in the UK, because we had a friend who was an emergency doctor, physician in the UK, who said the UK may not have even resuscitated after birth. So we got this wonderful year. But we had to face into the stark reality that Joshua, when the next moment came, he was going to die. So we fought a last battle to have him with us at home, to spend his last few weeks with us in a non-medicated environment. And we had a beautiful experience where our family came over, Luca got to be with his brother, and we got to really get that sense of what it was to be a family, even if it was only for those fleeting few weeks. And we got to have him with us and die in Beatrice's arms. And that, to me, is still one of the most profoundly beautiful things that ever happened. And unsurprisingly, a bit life-changing as well.
Wow. I'm speechless. I'm crying. It's lovely. Well, it's amazing, the emotion and the feeling within that.
And what a life-changing event. Almost like you come from one world and you're totally brought to be reminded what's important and what you really value, in spite of what you think you value.
Yeah. And I think when I look back, and I think, in tragedy you have to find hope and meaning. I really believe that Joshua was the greatest teacher that I've ever had, because he just came to kick me in the head.
Kind of woke you up in a sense.
Totally.
You told a lovely story of Luca's understanding of it. I remember hearing that story.
This is story time with Justin again.
I remember you telling
put
that
your
story.
feet up, folks. Here we go. And you got to tell the bear story. Yeah,
No,
we're way off.
No. David Flynn.
Yeah, I mean, that was just really one of the most amazing things. So the day that Joshua died, the night before he died, he had about 6 or 7 cardiac arrests with us, and we had a heart monitor on him, and we knew what was happening, and we'd been given the capacity and trained to administer morphine patches. So as he was getting into more difficulty, we were able to administer morphine so that his death would be at least painful, because his lungs were weak and he would eventually, unfortunately, die of asphyxiation. So he had to be relieved of his pain. So the night before, we thought he was going to die, and he didn't. He survived, and it was really beautiful because we took him to bed that night. He slept between the two of us, and we had the most wonderful night. And the next day, when we woke up, we knew that, you know, this was going to be the last day. And I said to Beatrice, look, it'd be great. My parents would come over. Can you take Luca? Get them to take Luca to the beach, and then, you know, we can have our final time with Joshua, because Luca was 3 and we didn't want him to see, obviously, Joshua dying at that moment. So my parents took him off to the beach, and actually I drove them off to the beach. But what was incredible was Beatrice went downstairs and she got everything ready for Luca. She came back up, and all this time I'm with Joshua for about 45 minutes, and he's still breathing and he's alive, and the heart monitor's there. When she arrives back up, I hand him to her, and as I put him into her arms, he takes his last breath and he dies. And it's astounding the way it happened, because I always think he really waited for her to come back, and then he knew, okay, now I'll die. And it was really compelling. And there's another part of that story that I'll come back to, but what happened then afterwards was that Luca was away with my parents, and eventually the undertakers would come to our house and they would take Joshua away. And my parents came back from the beach, and we were like burnt out, right? It was like an intense day, and we said, look, let's sit down and talk to Luca tomorrow about the fact that, you know, Joshua has died. So we told him that Joshua's gone off to the hospital, and he was used to Joshua being in hospital, and then we'd say, and now he died, and we'll tell him the next day. But we couldn't really go through it that night. We were wiped. So Luca was put into bed, and I suppose like the weirdest interaction for me was that when we put him into bed, I went into bed, and Beatrice then came in and she said, okay, you know, Luca's in bed, do you want to go and give him a kiss goodnight? And I said, yeah, great. And she said, when you go in and give him a kiss, just tell me if you notice anything different. So I went in, gave him a kiss, and I kind of was really astounded by what I sensed when I gave Luca a kiss. And I went into the bedroom, and I got into bed with Beatrice, and I said, what is it that you noticed? And she said, well, you tell me first. And I said,
that's like a test. I hate those type of questions. Like,
I'm like, I don't know whether I'm getting the right answer. And I was like, well, I know this sounds really weird, but I noticed I could smell Joshua's breath, and I could smell Joshua off Luca's face and his mouth. And she said, that's exactly what I noticed. And we were like, okay, well, that's really weird. And Joshua had this really specific taste, because he was tube fed, and he had oxygen tubes around his mouth and stuff. So it's a specific, almost medicalized smell off him at times. And we thought, that's really weird, but, you know, we're tired and whatever, so let's try and sleep. So we slept, and the next morning we could hear at the end of our bed this little 3-year-old Luca standing at the end of the bed, and wake up and I'm looking at him, and he's saying something about Joshua. And I said to him, what did you say? And he said, oh, baby Joshua made the sun come up this morning. And I was like, well, how does baby Joshua make the sun come up this morning? He said, well, I was sitting at the end of my bed, and I saw baby Joshua's face going all the way up into the sky and into the clouds, and he was beside the sun, and then he went away, and he made the sun come up. And the two of us like just bolted up in bed, looked at this 3-year-old and looked at each other and thought, okay, some things just don't need to be explained and don't need to be thought about too much. But it was a really bizarre and profound moment to have this 3-year-old who had no idea yet that his brother had died.
I guess they pick up on the emotion, or some, you know, almost the
it's
palpability
it's
of.
like animals. It's like when you're going away on holidays, the dog can feel it, and they don't even have to know it. Like, they're not even told it; they just feel it. I think where we forget that we're.
And it's the same way you feel. If you feel sad, like I know it myself sometimes. If I feel really tired and sad, or a bit kind of battered by life, I'll sit there, and one of the cats will jump up and sit in my lap, and the cats never sit in my lap unless I'm meditating or if I'm like overwhelmed and exhausted. The cat. That's the only sense they'll sit in my lap is because they can sense, oh, you're like vulnerable and you need, you're not going to be predator. I don't know what it is anyway, but
I agree, and I think kids at that age are so, there's no judgment inside them. They just meet life as it is, and they see things as they are. So whatever wisdom was imparted upon him that day, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, it was really quite beautiful. But it was quite a game-changing moment, and that whole experience always comes back to the deep sense of gratitude that I have for his life and his death, because of course I would have liked him to live, but that wasn't to be the case. So I can actually find joy in that short life because he changed the way that we are. Now, I didn't change the way that we were straight away, because after his death I went back to, flex my muscles and man up.
Back to know what you do. How
Well,
you
the
deal
only
with
way you
things.
can deal with it is
Or
get on
something
and
you're
get
really
working.
good with it.
Yeah.
I want to be useful. I'm going to build a business and it's going to be bigger and better than the last one. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll show everybody that I've
And
got over
was
this.
that your natural response? That was.
Totally. Like,
I'm not sitting around licking my wounds. I'm
Automatic.
getting straight into.
I was about 3 weeks after his funeral, and the CEO of an Irish bank was at his funeral, and I was pitching an idea to his board, and I was in his offices, and he said to me, really like this. Afterwards, he said, I really like this idea, but what are you doing here? Like, it was his funeral a few weeks ago. And I remember looking at him going, well, this is what I do. This is how I cope. It's time to move on. And when I think about the two paths that we followed, and this really speaks to the core of psychological safety and difficult conversations and leaning into the difficulty. Okay, so we either lean into stuff that's challenging or we lean out. And high performance leadership, high performance teams don't shirk away from the difficult conversations and the difficult things that need to be done. And if I roll back a little bit, what's really interesting is when I brought Luca down to the beach that morning and Beatrice was still with Joshua, who died, what she did was she then took this dead child and lay him out on his changing mat and went through this whole process that lasted, I don't know, maybe 90 minutes, where she cleaned and prepared the body. He had all these tape on his face and stuff because he had oxygen masks and tube fed. So she cleaned and took care of him, caressed his body, had this deep connection with him. And I went off and down to the beach. So I come back and I walk in towards the end of this and I see this experience that I can only really kind of describe as otherworldly or almost alien experience, to witness this deep connection that she had with her dead child lying in front of her. And she didn't even really notice that I was in the room, and I just stood there to bear witness to this. I've never seen anything like it, and I hope I never see anything like it again. But it was incredibly primal, and it made me think, wow, we have this like deep innate sense within us to know what to do. So when she'd done all that and then kind of saw me and noticed me, then I said, okay, look, I phoned the funeral directors. They're on the way and they're going to be here in 15 minutes. So I then had maybe 5 minutes where I held on to his dead body just to carry him to the car, and I put him in his coffin. But very limited time, and I'd kind of run in, been at the back of this, and then boom, and off I went. Now, that was 11 years ago, and my wife has never been in therapy for the loss of her son. I've trained as a therapist because I needed so much help, but she never went into therapy. She came into Ireland and she walked with a dog in the mountains for about 6 months and just came to terms with the fact that he's dead, and that's okay. And life is moving on. She grieved, she loved him, she missed him. But she went through a really simple primal interaction. The absolute reality of what had happened is abundantly clear because she was completely close to the tragedy of what had unfolded. I didn't get close to it, and then I spent the next 2 or 3 years trying to run desperately away from it, and that ultimately led me down a path of multiple autoimmune diseases. I'd gone from a healthy person to irritable bowel syndrome, leaky gut, adult asthma, chronic pain, chronic fatigue. extreme anxiety, depression bouts, culminating in suicidal ideation, desperately thinking suicide is the only option, a deep hatred of myself, shame, guilt. As a father, your son died, could not do any more. Never having the capacity to speak, not knowing how to speak because of the way I've been conditioned from a young age, especially in that work and culture environment. But growing up, in a tough school environment, you don't speak about how you feel. And the more we contain all of this, eventually it just explodes.
And this was, you couldn't even talk to like a therapist or something, like there was just no way.
You probably were afraid to go to a therapist.
Yeah.
Because back then there was the idea that if you went to a therapist, you were broken. I'm not one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is back a number of years ago.
10 years ago.
10 years ago. And I remember, like, this is to show you how crazy this was. I actually thought that because Beatrice was so okay with it all and calm about it, of course, we still do. We both cry at anything that happens on TV. When you've been in that emotional impact, it always comes up, but in a nice way. But I felt that she wasn't doing well enough, right? So I said to her, I think you need to go to therapy. And she was saying, oh, I don't really. I feel okay. And I said, no, I think you do. And I said, I think Luca needs some therapy as well. So she said, okay, well, I'll go, but we have to all go along. So we went to see this therapist, and we all went along.
The three of you together? Like,
three of us together.
Can you please fix us, please?
Yeah. And we all turned up, and I said to the therapist, now, I do think that the two of them may need help. Okay. And,
they're very masculine of you. Yeah, just
we've been through a lot, and they need help. So she has a session with us, and then she said, okay, well, Beatrice will come back for session, and she said, I'd like you to come back for session 2. And I was like, okay, well, I'll come back, but there's nothing wrong with me. And I came back, and I had like maybe 2 sessions with her, and I had no interest in being there. And I remember, in the second session that I was with her, she said to me, how are you now? And I was back working like a lunatic, right? I was flying 200 times a year. I was away every week, so I flew every week. I only came home at the weekends. I was running 2 businesses in 2 different countries. And I sat down and I said to her, she said, how are you? And I said, yeah, I'm not too bad. I said, but I had a weird dream. And she said, what was your weird dream? And I said, I was on a plane and it was going to crash. And I thought, well, that's okay, because then I'll be dead and all the noise in my head will end. So I was quite happy about that. And she said to me, I have to stop you there. I can't talk to you anymore. I'm not skilled to be able to deal with this. I'll need to refer you to somebody else. And I thought, I just had a dream. Like, what's the problem? So I just walked out there and I thought, well, that's just stupid. There's no point in being there if you can't even have those conversations. But that was the moment, I think, for me, the tipping point when things really started to unravel. And I was definitely medicating myself through alcohol. So if I reflect back, I was probably drinking every day. And it was really good, because if you're like, have a nice high flying job and you're meeting like lots of really wealthy, successful people, you can mask your drinking behavior because it's like a really expensive bottle of Barolo. But it might as well have been just an old, manky bottle of brandy.
Can of Scrumpy Jacks.
It was just alcohol to ease the pain and suffering. So it all started to unravel and culminated in having a panic attack in a really important meeting. And to sum up the kind of stupidity that I still believed in at that point, I had this panic attack and I had a bunch of really important people in the room. And I felt like my heart was going to pop out of my head. And my left arm, I lost all feeling in my left arm. And I was thinking, this could be a stroke, because they definitely say something happens in the left side of your body. So I thought, it feels like a stroke, but I haven't fallen over. And I felt like my heart was going to pop out. And I thought, maybe it's a heart attack. But again, I'm still here. And I'm still managing this meeting. And I'm still talking to people around me.
And this is in the middle of the meeting.
This is in the middle of the meeting. And then this moment happened where my periphery vision just disappeared. It was like somebody just put blinkers on me. So now I couldn't see left or right anymore. So every time somebody spoke, I had to like spin around on my chair and look at them, because I couldn't see out of my periphery side. So I was thinking, periphery vision's gone, heart's pounding, left side is numb. Still haven't fallen over. I'll keep going. So I concluded the meeting, right? 25 minutes or half an hour later, concluded the meeting, sent them all off, didn't say anything to anybody. And I thought, I'll go to the hospital now and just check, see if that was okay. So I hopped in a taxi and I was going to the hospital. And about 5 minutes in the taxi, I thought, I actually feel quite good. I think I need to go. So I went to the bar instead.
Oh my
had a couple of
God.
drinks, and thought that'll be fine. So I flew back home to Ireland, and I went into the house, and Beatrice said to me, "How are you?" And I said, "I had this little funny thing where, you know, I thought maybe it was a stroke or heart attack." And she said to me, "Okay, enough is enough." She said, "You have stopped petting our dogs, and we love our dogs. We have 2 golden retrievers." She goes, "For the last month, when you come back, you don't pet our dogs anymore." She goes, "You have no energy left for anything else." And she said, "You're falling apart. You're physically unwell." I mean, I was seeing pulmonologists, cardiologists, rheumatologists, gastroenterologists.
And you weren't even 40 at this stage.
Oh, I was 36, 37.
Wow.
And I'd gone from like being healthy to like a massive decline in the space of 3 years. I was spending, I don't know, €1,000-ish a month just on medication to try and, you know, keep moving. And that was it. That was like, okay, then I realized something has to change. And I knew that I'd been really feeling desperately warm thoughts around suicide. And this is a really challenging thing, and something for anybody who's listening. It's really important to take a moment to ask for help and speak to somebody, because I didn't think anybody else could ever feel like this. So the last thing I could do was talk about it. But the minute I started talking about it, it already started to change. So when I could sit down with Beatrice and actually cry that day and say, "I'm not really holding all this together," and she's like looking at me going, "Well, you know, no shit, Sherlock." But she knows me well enough to know that, you know, like they say in Eastern philosophy, you know, when the student is ready, so too is the teacher. There was no point in her telling me it's time to slow down. I eventually had to be slowed down, and that just needed to be through my own processes. And that led to an opportunity for change and profound change, and, you know, to change my diet, my lifestyle, to understand the importance of sleep, like all the things that I was chronically depriving myself of. So this was 3 years after Joshua's death. But again, you know, I always reflect with Beatrice that if Joshua had lived, I don't think we'd be together. I think we'd be divorced. She wouldn't have stuck it out with me. I was intolerable. I don't think I would have stuck it out with them. I don't think I may even be alive. You know, the path was clear, and something had to give in your life. And I think sometimes, you know, the universe or God or whatever you want to connect with comes along, gives you a slap in the head and says, "Do you want to make a different decision right now?" And if you're lucky, you pay attention. And I think I was really lucky to see that.
Wow. Amazing. And then, like,
Team's clutching the questions here now. That's just like, there's such profundity in everything you've said that it deserves now a second for now mic drop. Okay, right. Sorry about that. No, it really is. What you're saying is incredible, JC.
But it was almost like you didn't take the time to grieve or to address what had happened, or at any moment to stop and check in with yourself, or to even and to check in with those around you. Like, you were just consumed with this mission, continuously mission. I must win the next battle. I must win the next deal.
But ultimately, it comes back to the product of your environment. That if you've been on, you know, survival of the fittest and dog eat dog and macho, money, loads of money, successful will make me happy, keep going on this, and it's just that bullheaded, you know, egoic sense of just drive at all expenses, and then eventually, you know, life waking you up, hitting you enough times that you eventually saw the message and crumbled a bit.
And then in terms of rebuilding yourself, what was the path of rebuilding? Was it having to address the grief and having to just kind of learn to slow down, to go from being a human doing to a human being?
Yeah, very much so. And I think one of the interesting things I read recently, because I was kind of researching this whole idea, because when I kind of pare this back and I talk, and I'm working with leadership teams about this very openly, because it's really impactful for people to go, like, if you don't face into the reality of your life will come and get you, right? There's no two ways about it. You have to just face into some of the difficulty that you have in life. And I started to research this whole idea of, you know, being close to death, being really close to the dead person, and the reality of being close to it. And I discovered that it was only in the American Civil War that we started to have funeral directors. And we started to outsource this whole idea of our dead bodies going to another party. And it was a great business idea established by some soldiers who realized that especially Protestant families in the US would want to have the body of their dead son, typically as it was back then, brought back home. So they realized that there was a way of preserving the body. So they started the whole process of how do we use different chemicals to preserve a body and send it back. And believe it or not, they used to preserve the body with cyanide. So people close to the dead body were dying. And that's also where some of the myths that dead bodies are dangerous. Because alive bodies are dangerous, because if they have viruses, whatever, and they fart or cough or sneeze, they spread the virus. Dead bodies don't fart, cough, and
There's
sneeze.
no bacteria there left.
So, and it's perfectly safe to be around dead bodies for a few days. But what we've done now is we've outsourced this to a whole new industry. So we basically give our dead relatives to a company, and they kind of clean them up and put a bit of makeup on, and then they charge us to take the dead body back again. And we don't get that closeness. So I always step it back and think, the person who washed our dead child faced into the reality of the situation there and then, and the person who didn't had to face into it much later. And I think in all parts of our lives and all difficult conversations or challenging moments, the sooner we face into the reality, the easier it is to come to terms with it. And the longer we leave it, the more likely it becomes this huge problem. So, yeah, it took me 6 months of therapy. I was very lucky that I got to work with an Indian therapist whose sole focus is on the non-medicated interventions, which is exactly what I wanted, because my father had been desperately ill all his life with chronic stress and depression. My brother, a couple of years ago, ended up dying of an overdose for all of his challenges growing up. So I was very aware of the path that I didn't want to be on. Now, I did end up taking medication for about 2 months because I was preparing to kill myself. So it was a very significant moment. So medication as an intervention is important at times. But there was a plan to get me off it. And really, in that therapy, it was coming to terms with me. And I often thought at that stage that Joshua's death is the problem. But actually, it was lots of things. You know, it was coming to terms with my relationship with my parents growing up, my father's illness, the challenges of my relationship with my mother, my family. And the more you kind of clear out and face into the reality, and, you know, to use that analogy, the more you kind of wash those dead bodies, those difficult things that you haven't faced into, there's a spaciousness that comes from it. And I remember maybe 3 months into therapy, starting to think, I don't think this is really working at all. And I remember being in Manchester airport, and I'd come off my medication, and I still kept thinking, he keeps telling me that I'm going to start noticing things differently and feel different about myself. And there's this moment when I'm waiting for a plane from Manchester to Dublin, and Manchester airport, as you guys have probably been in, is not the most beautifully structural building in the world. But I just had this moment, it just went click. Now, I'd been meditating for weeks up until this point, and I suddenly just saw this beautiful roof in the airport, and I thought, that looks really nice. And then I kind of looked around at the gate, and I started to see smiling faces and people with kids and people getting ready to get in a plane. And I thought, wow, look at all these people. And it was almost like looking at my hands. I felt like, you know, when you see a baby look at their hands for the first time. I suddenly was like, anybody who was near me must have thought that guy's clearly stoned. But it was like for the first time at that stage, like 38 years, I was in possession of my own body. I was really aware of who I am. I wasn't thinking about where I need to be or what I need to do or how I need to get there. I was just there. And I thought, this is a lovely airport. And these are really interesting people around me. And that was the moment when it all changed.
Wow. It's like going from preoccupied with what you're trying to do to suddenly actually being present with where you're at and observing the beauty, or just even observing the life that's happening around you, as opposed to observing what you're meant to do next and who's getting in your way.
So say, for example, say that's the seed of transformation. You know, the seed is planted there. Obviously, you need to continue with the analogy. You need lots of sunshine, you need water, and you need the right elements for it to grow and blossom into Justin 2.0. Sorry, excuse my tone there, my tone shift there. So like, you know, obviously that was about 9 years ago, and we've known you probably 6 or 7 years, and we, you know, you've evolved hugely since we've known you, you know, and we all continue to evolve, each of us every day.
Better way.
Who knows? That's yeah, obviously in a better way.
Tell me.
Oh, yeah, obviously. Justin, you're great. You're dead.
great?
I think
Thanks.
you're wonderful. I think you're wonderful. I love you dearly. But so what have been the, like, what have, like, obviously I know them, but could you talk a bit about what have been the main kind of elements which have helped you to kind of grow more into yourself, into becoming a more whole person that you are today?
Yeah, I think simplicity was critical, right? So that awareness and suddenly noticing that I'm here and I'm aware of myself was important. Now, of course, being like, you know, alpha, highly competitive, driven lunatic, right? I still suddenly became aware, and I thought, I've conquered it all now. This is fantastic.
I'm King Alpha.
I'm King Alpha.
I'm king of the jungle.
And now I'm going to be this deeply profound, conscious person.
I'm going
right?
to be the best spiritual person ever.
Yes, I'm going to be I'm going to be JC.
dominate. I'm going to dominate all these spiritual other people.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I can
God
definitely
complex.
start a cult here.
So it's God complex.
Total God complex, right? So I'm thinking I'm on it. And when I was in therapy, one of the things that my therapist, Dr. Pradeep Chhabra, kept saying to me all the time was, you need to stop drinking alcohol. Now, he's an Indian physician in Ireland. I was running a financial services company with offices in 2 different countries. And I said to him, you've no idea what you're talking about. Like, you've never drank, right? I have to drink. This is part of what I do. And he was like, yeah, well, you know, I think we've kind of noticed that a lot of things have gone wrong in your life. Alcohol's around them. Dismissed. And he said, I think you'll change in time. Just wait. So from that moment in Manchester, 2 months later, I'm out in our offices in Malta, got a bunch of clients who've come over. We've gone out for a big dinner and lots of drinking and food and everything else. And I've had a few drinks and I'm walking back to my hotel. As I'm walking back to my hotel, I go along and pick up, you know, God knows what, some kind of kebab, right? So here we have alcohol and bad food still prevalent in my life. But as I'm walking along, I see this kid on the ground with a bouncer holding him by the head, blood pouring from his face, and the bouncer about to kick him in the head. So I scream at the bouncer, jump in front of this kid, and, you know, the kid slumps to the ground, covered in blood. Bouncer steps back, and I've got go and pick the kid up, and I've got blood all over me. He's only an 18-year-old kid. So I ask somebody else to call the police, and the police come, and I say to them, you know, there's the guy there. He's the culprit. The police don't arrest him. And what ensues really quickly is I start to realize the police are never going to arrest him, and actually they're all in cahoots with this guy. So I thankfully put my phone on and record what happens next. But I get arrested. So I get arrested by the cops, dragged along the ground with my face, thrown into a police car, brought into a police cell, put in the cell that night, roughed up while I was brought to the cell and put in. Eventually, I'm struggling. I still have asthma really badly at the stage. I have an asthma attack at about 4:00 in the morning. They call an ambulance. They make me crawl through the police station to get into the ambulance. Go to A&E with cops in tow, and I'm on a gurney in A&E, being inspected. It's like a hospital bed.
Okay.
Handcuffed to the hospital bed. Not allowed to make a phone call. It's now the next day, right? I'm supposed to be in my office. Beatrice, my wife, doesn't know where I am. So I've gone from that moment thinking I have it all sussed 2 months earlier to being handcuffed to a hospital bed with 2 police officers standing beside me. And I'm being told that I assaulted a police officer and they have witnesses. And I was thinking, I didn't assault anybody. But I knew that I had my phone. I'd recorded some stuff, but I didn't really know what was there. So what ensued afterwards was I was then brought in a perp walk, as they call it in the US. So the police had teed up all of the media, news, papers, the TV journals, and I'm brought to the courthouse to be arraigned. I'm all over the front pages of all the newspapers.
What does arraigned mean?
So you go in front of a judge, and the police put forward their case. And then the judge decides, are you going to be held on remand in prison until your trial date. And on my board, thankfully, I had several lawyers on my board who were all kind of pretty blown away when I say to them, I need somebody to come to the cop shop because I've been arrested. And we get into the courthouse, and the police are petitioning for my passport to be withdrawn and for me to be held in prison pending trial, which would take maybe 6 to 9 months, which means I can't go home. Now, at that stage, I was meditating, thank God. I'd been in therapy, and I was able to kind of be present to what was going on. If it had happened 2 months earlier, I would have been a goner. But what ensued then for the next 6 months was 4 High Court appearances. My legal team told me to put my affairs in order. I was probably going to get 2.5 years in prison if the police could prove that I assaulted them, and they had a couple of witnesses who were road sweepers who said they witnessed the whole thing. And roll on our last court date. Thankfully, we were able to get some video, and luckily I had access to some people in the UK who were ex-special forces who were able to come out to Malta and get hold of video evidence that was being hidden from us. And we won our court case, and I didn't go to prison, but I learned lots of lessons. So one was that, if you don't have enough money, you will probably go to prison, because only for the fact that I was able to get evidence to corroborate the fact that the police were lying. We then proved they were lying. We proved that their witnesses were lying, and the judge kicked the whole thing out. But it was a moment where I thought, okay, my life really has to change now. And afterwards, in the days post that, I stopped drinking. I think it was probably around the same time. I went plant-based because I started to think I need to be healthier, mind, body, more conscious. And a process then followed where lots of things happened, and I went and trained with, some Hasidic monks in Japan, and I went on spiritual journeys to the East, and I studied Buddhism, psychology, philosophy, Taoism, Hinduism, so lots of other things.
Loads of isms. But the principal thing was, remove all the things that disconnect you from yourself. So even though I did nothing wrong that night when I was arrested, I still was drinking alcohol, and I still needed to make that change. And I still feel that moment was just like Joshua. It was another moment of a slap in the head. You're going to get away with this. But were there times that when I was drunk and out of control previously in my life that I needed to be taught a lesson? Absolutely. So it was another big, profound moment. And to think about going to prison for 2.5 years, my son at that stage was 9, and to have to say, I can't come back, really, again, woke me up. So it isn't like one moment, and the journey from being really ill to being really well is not a blue pill. It's a period of deep self-discovery and coming to terms with accepting yourself as you are, and coming to terms with being okay with the things that you did wrong, and coming to terms with guilt and shame, and then realizing actually I can let them down now, I can let them go, and then just realizing, well, what's your values? And my values after that, I realized, were to just be the best dad that I could be, and the best husband that I could be. And traveling around the world and not being present, that doesn't really fit. And I knew that my son had another 7 or 8 years of being around in my life. So I changed my life. I studied all these kind of isms, and then I went to UCD and did a master's in mindfulness based, and I've studied neuroscience, and I've studied, wellness, performance, high performance, all that kind of stuff. And I get to now work with people, which is great fun. But most importantly, I get to live my value statement, which is to be clear and present and available to my family. And that's the most important thing I can do. Good. Beautiful, lovely.
Have you got it sorted now?
No, trying. Constantly. I'm getting better.
Can we finish with one thing?
Yeah.
Can we finish with the bear story?
Oh,
okay. So we have this cool Sunday podcast club, we call it, and it's like the modern day book club, in that I shouldn't say the modern day. There are loads of book clubs out there, and they're extremely modern and incredible. It's just a different version of it. That instead of books, we listen to podcasts, watch a movie, or it could be a poem, or it could be little video that you watch, and then we all sit around and we discuss it. And a number of times, Justin has been asked to retell this story because it's so good.
Yeah, he told it like, so he did it for like a year and a half all through COVID, like over Zoom and all sorts of things. And everyone has 3 minutes to kind of say their thoughts on the podcast or whatever it might be. And time and time again, that bear story. So yeah, I think I'm going to get a bit of
Without
chocolate.
further ado, ladies and gentlemen,
Justin Caffrey with his bear story.
The bear story. Right.
You've got
your blankets again.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to stuck my thumb here.
So I'd gone on this retreat with these really ancient Hasidic monks called the Yamabushi in northwestern Japan, and they've lived the same life that they've lived for 1,500 years. And part of the retreat, they decided that they'd allow Westerners to train with the Yamabushi, and they come from the samurai lineage. So I looked on this website. I don't even know how I found it. I thought, that looks lovely. I'm a meditator. I think I'll be able to do that. And I thought that'd be something different to do.
I always wanted to be a samurai.
I've always wanted to be
Level
samurai.
2 JC.
So I thought, I'll definitely go and do that. So off I flew and went to hang out with them. And when I arrived for this retreat, I started to really notice that the other people who were on this retreat looked like very super fit young people. And I started to think, oh, there must be a little bit more arduous work attached to this retreat than I thought. So what happens is when you go into it, you arrive and they take your phone, they take your watch, they take your clothes. You have to now wear these traditional clothes for the whole few days. You're not allowed to know what time it is. You're not allowed to contact anybody in the outside world. And the whole purpose of the next 5 days is to disorientate you as much as they possibly can. So they wake you up in all times of the day and there's no sleep.
Sounds deadly.
It was really intense, right? It was great fun. It was proper kind of Boy Scout territory. And you're sleeping on the floor in this little shack, and there's cats and animals walking around you, and there's no doors, and you've got no pillow. You're just basically handed a blanket and told that's where you sleep. And you're not allowed to talk, and you're not allowed to look each other in the eye for 6 days. And if you breach this, you're out, right? So, competition, fantastic.
Yes!
I can win.
Who's the best?
It'd be great. So lots of things happen over these 6 days, and they literally kill you, right? So they have you walking for 10, 12 hours up two of the highest mountains in Japan. At night time we had to go through these ceremonies where they burn all these twigs in this tiny room, and they make this toxic smoke, and you have to stay there until you can't stay there any longer, and you crawl out on the ground to leave. And they say that this ceremony is to teach you that this is how hard life is, and you have to be able to sustain a lot of the challenges in life, but also know when the right time is to exit. So they do weird stuff, and they wake you up. You think you've gone to sleep, and now it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and they come in, they blow this conch shell, and out you go, and you're in this kind of military style procession. So we're kind of 3 days in, and we've gone through some like really mad shit, right? Like bonker stuff that was incredibly profound, but astounding too. And you know, you sign a disclaimer when you go there, and it says like you might die, you might fall off a cliff, you might be killed by spiders, you might be killed by bears. And I've done loads of stuff in America, and you think, oh yeah, this is just disclaim. None of this ever happens. The Japanese are like the Germans, right? When they tell you this might happen, it really might happen. And I don't mean to dismiss the Germans. I'm married to one, right? But they're very much, this is the case, and this is what happens. So I realized this actually really happens, because day 2, we nearly fell off the side of a massive cliff. We were holding on with these sticks that they gave us, and they said, you must hike with these sticks. And I thought, oh, that's a nice little addition. But no, the stick is so that when you're in these incredibly windy areas, you don't fall off the side of the mountain. So whatever time it is, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the morning, they wake us up this time. They say, right, everybody out, into procession. Nobody's looking at each other. And we go off into the forest with these little Japanese lanterns. So a little candle inside one of those lantern things. And somebody at the front of our procession has one, and somebody at the back has one. And there's 6 of us who were doing what's called master training in Yamabushi, and then there's 3 monks with us.
Obviously, you were in the master training.
I was, of course, winning at master. Yeah.
Of course you were.
Have I ever told you I'm a master trainer? For
Justin,
Yamabushi?
you're great.
Thanks.
You're brilliant.
And so we head off out into the forest, and they tell us, you know, walk, move. You don't know how long you're going to walk for. You don't know what's going on. But it's very late, and we're really disorientated. We go into this dense, thick forest, and at the front is the leader, who was a 74-year-old Japanese monk called Master Hoshino, who was the fittest, most agile person I've ever come across in my life, because we chased this guy up and down mountains, and 3 of the people who were on this course with me were all ex-military from Australia and New Zealand, and they were struggling to keep up with this guy, and I was very much at the back of the pack. But as we're walking through, he puts up his hand and everybody stops. Nobody knows why. And there's a monk behind me, and he calls back, and he said he called back for another lantern. So I get handed this lantern, and then I pass it to the person in front of me again, pass it to the person in front of me again, and the lanterns are being passed up. Now, the only thing that I always wondered when we were like doing this was that Master Hoshino always had this little bell hanging off the side of his traditional little suit of the Yamabushi, and I never really knew what the bell was. I thought it must be some kind of really spiritual thing. So I thought we'd find out at some point.
I want a bell.
I want a bell, right? So he had the magic bell, and the lights went up to him, and he is, I would say, maybe 5 foot tall. So the lantern goes up to him, and we're all kind of, just a few people behind him, and he lifts this lantern up and he holds it up in the air. And as he holds it up in the air, I can see that there's something standing beside him. And the light moves across, and he holds it up, and there's a massive black bear on its back feet, looking at us and looking at him. And it just growls at him. And he is looking at the bear, he's holding the lantern. And I think, we're going to die right now, but we're not allowed to move. And they're very specific, you mustn't move, you don't talk, you don't say anything at any time. It's not just because of the bear, all the time. So we all stand really still, thinking, what's he going to do? Like, it's like a martial arts moment, or what's going to happen next? So he reaches down to his suit, and he takes up the little bell, and he holds the bell up to the bear, and he goes, ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. And the bear looks at him and the bell, and comes down onto its 4 feet, turns away, and goes off into the trees. And we're all like, wow, it's incredible. So, but we couldn't say anything, right? We're still in silence. So off we go, and we trek into the forest. And 2 days later, the whole thing is coming to an end. And there's a timeline where we're allowed to talk again. So 2 days have gone, lots of other mad shit's gone on over the next 2 days. But we come into the hut and we stop, and then the monks said to us, okay, it's all right now, you can talk. And there was 5 of us there, and the only thing that happened the minute we could all talk was everybody looked at each other and went, holy fuck, what about the bear? What was all that about? And we were like, we nearly died. So we said to the monks, like, is that normal? And they went, no, not really. It wasn't planned at all. But they said for 1,500 years, the bear is most likely the thing that's going to kill people in the mountains. And the Yamabushi, so the principal thing of what we learned was Shinrin Yoko, which is that forest bathing approach. It's that connection, deep connection to nature, understanding that when we're commune with nature, we're safe. So for 1,500 years, they've been ringing bells to bears to let them know, no trouble here, no fight. So they rang the bell. The bear went, it's okay, I won't kill you. And off he went. So no need for the sword when you have a little bell.
I love that story.
Have you got your magic bell yet?
No, it's still in the post apparently.
JC, you're brilliant. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you
Lovely.
so much.
Thanks.
For anyone listening who wants to learn more about your coaching and your work, where will they?
You can find out my corporate stuff is on yourbottomline.com. My personal work, one-to-one stuff, justincaffrey.com, or on Instagram, you can follow me, Justin_Caffrey.
And YouTube, you've got loads of YouTube.
Oh yeah, there's loads of free stuff on YouTube. So I put up lots of stuff around polyvagal theory, neuroscience, behavior. So I share lots and lots of stuff on there, which is completely free. There's breath techniques. One of the breath techniques that was born out of one of my greatest teachers, Dr. Pradeep Chadha, has been watched, 500,000 times, with phenomenal results. People talking about ending panic attacks because they practice it for a week or two. It's a very simple technique. If you type in hand pressing technique, Justin Caffrey, it'll walk you through it, and it's really impactful. If you're feeling stressed, overwhelmed, it's a great place to start.
Brilliant.
You're a
Justin
legend.
Caffrey, you're amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Stephen.
You're welcome, Justin.
That was great crack. Thank you, JC.
Stories were class.
What
I
did
loved
we
it.
talk for too long? How long was that?
I'd say it was an hour and a half, I'm guessing.
Brilliant.
How long were we, Sarah? Yeah.
Class. It was so that like
Oh, that was
really
fun.
warmed up.
I won't even touch this.
Really warmed up when we kicked into your store. Like, you know, all the high performance stuff is like a warm up. And then like literally I was crying during your story.
Oh, yeah.
I was
I feel you